a lot of callers, theists in particular, call in to share near-death experiences as evidence for the supernatural or even God, an afterlife. And I'm an atheist who just recently had a near-death experience, and I did not come away with that same impression. In fact, mine had some unique elements that helped me understand what caused it in the first place and why it didn't seem so divine.
What is a near-death experience exactly for you?
Well, for me, I had my heart stop because I had a rather major, severe heart attack. And
I'm sorry to hear that.
While the very professional and great ER crew was working to get me going again, I had maybe a dream, don't know if you could call it that, but while unconscious, an experience I remembered that when I popped back to was stuck in my head.
Yeah.
That's what I call a near-death experience.
Okay, for you, a near-death experience is remembering something that you think occurred when you were unconscious.
Well, like the best I could do, think it occurred while unconscious. Of course, time dilates, and we have no idea exactly when a memory comes into your head at that point. So maybe it was the instant before or after I was conscious. I can only tell how it felt at the time.
Well, my understanding is that, when you remember something, that memory, regardless of when the time you are remembering is being formed in your mind. Basically, there's the structures in your brain that imagine things and remember things are, for many people, unsettlingly similar. But whether or not your memory was entirely generated after the near-death experience or generated during the near-death experience, did you want to go into further details about what that experience was or what significance it holds for you?
Well, I can tell you about the experience because it's an interesting story, and then what happened to me immediately thereafter that shaped my memory of it, because you guys hit a number of things right on the head. What I experienced, believed to experience during the near-death episode, and then what I experienced during the conscious moments after it that kind of shaped that memory in my head. After I arrived at the ER and they'd done an EKG and confirmed I was having a heart attack, they could go into kind of like rush mode. So they bring a crash cart in. The staff all starts going into automatic process. Everyone's got a job to do. They start doing it. And shortly after that, within a few minutes of that, I lost consciousness. And I found myself in a dark room. And I hear a phone ring. Phone's ringing. So I pick it up. I pick up the phone, I put the receiver to my head, and this thing starts to suck the wind out of me, right out of my face. And I can't pull the phone away from my head. I try, but I can't. It keeps sucking the air away, so I try to fight back for a breath. But each time I try and draw a breath, it sucks the wind away from me. And I feel like I'm slipping, like I'm going to pass out, even though I now know I was already unconscious. But I get angry, so I start fighting this thing back, fighting this phone for my breath, drawing as hard as I can. Hard as I can, draw a breath, and it pulls my breath away again. I try again, pull a breath, and it sucks away again. But the third time or so, I draw the breath as hard as I can, and the lights come back on in the room. I'm laying on the gurney, obviously. There's a nurse standing over me with an ambu bag, breathing for me, and the machines all around the room going, and it dawned on me right then, it's like, holy cow, that was a near-death experience. And not only that, I happened to wake up. Just by fortune, I either could have died or not woken up or woken up much later to see there was physical stimuli all about the room. Someone breathing for me, machines going off, and my dying, unconscious brain is still trying to take in things, fight for survival, grasp at whatever sense you can get a hold of and go for it. And it was amazing to me because so many people say, I saw a light at the antenna, or they think there's something supernatural happening given them this experience. Because so rarely do you wake up during that moment where you're nearly dead and get to see that my theory, how I believe it, it's what's happening to your body and the world around you, still coming through in your brain, trying to make sense of it.
Have you always been, I assume you're atheist?
Yeah.
I am an atheist, yeah.
Okay. And are you attributing...
I was not always an atheist, though I was raised devoutly Pentecostal. It wasn't until my late teens, early 20s that I really kind of came to the conclusion that I was an atheist.
Are you attributing the lack of a theistic experience because you were never exposed to it? Is that kind of the point?
No, what I'm saying is because I was able to become conscious and see the stimuli around me in the room, the nurse breathing for me with the bag valve mask, the alarms going off from the machines.
Okay.
Those corresponded very directly with the experience I had in the unconscious state.
The reason I ask that is because you know it's not uncommon to hear people say that they had a near-death experience. I even encountered somebody who said she fell through like a two-story structure and fell, and she had basically a near-death experience and thought that she was interacting with Jesus. So it's not uncommon to hear people point to these experiences as evidence that their God is real, which is why I was asking if you're bringing this up to sort of contrast your experience with the experience that we might hear from people who are attributing that thing to a God.
Well, if I perhaps didn't have the chance to see what else was going on in the room, or that if my conviction was a bit differently, I can't know how I would have attributed. I can only think about it with my own brain.
That's true.
I do know I wasn't actually out of the woods quite yet, because it was after that they intubated me, and either they weren't sedating me enough or I couldn't pass out because I had what's called flash pulmonary edema. My lungs filled with fluid because my heart had stopped. And that was after I'd woken up and then gone to the thing they intubate and you're choking. And I felt right about then, I think I'm going to die. Because until then, you're just scared. Well, maybe it's not as bad. Right at that moment, it's, oh, this might be the end.
You may be braver than the average person if people are running around you, you're being intubated, and you still are sort of like,
I'm sorry to hear that you had to go through that experience. That sounds traumatic. And I had a family member that was basically dying, and he was gasping for his last breaths, and I think he was essentially drowning. I think in the fluids in his lungs. So it kind of makes me wonder, like.
That's actually what was happening, because everyone around me is telling you to be calm, be patient, because you're motioning or gesturing. Because after they'd intubated, my lungs are still full of fluid. They hadn't pulled the fluid out of my lungs yet, and that's actually brings up the second part. People that say there's no such thing as an atheist in a foxhole, despite I was raised very devoutly Pentecostal, like holy rollers, dancing the aisle.
You know what I'm curious though, Dennis, is that if you were to hear a theist point to a near-death experience, something very similar, and they were absolutely sure it was, an angel giving them breath or something like that, what would your response be? I'm a little curious how somebody who's gone through a near-death experience might respond to a theist who says that this was a formative reason why they think their God is real. What would you tell them?
See, it's challenging because everything. The way you look back and try and piece something together, you only have the bits of information you were given. The only piece of the puzzle in your own brain, your own logic center, to try and make sense of that. Most of my family that I have to deal with, every time I want to talk about it, I end up kind of tiptoeing because it's more important for me to be friends or family and to listen and say that's pretty crazy. But I usually would ask kind of the same questions you were saying right there. When you asked me the very first thing, do you know when that memory formed? How do you know it formed when you were unconscious or versus right after? Or the other things that were going on in the room were actually what your brain was trying to make sense of. And it almost always comes down to I have faith, because you can't really know at that moment when your brain is in scatter form what actually was happening. And maybe I'm not telling the stories that actually happened. I'm sure I'd get a different story from the ER nurse.
Well, I don't think they had a vacuum phone to your face, hopefully. Although that may be your mind trying to make sense of a machine breathing for it. But I think instances where faith is given as a blanket example are always sort of, what the show is designed to deal with. But particularly when it's just is a huge stopping block to the beginning steps of a person becoming interested in the actual work and knowledge of what it is to be a skeptic. Because as you said, it's my brain piecing things together, the only thing I had was my logic center, how did my memories form? Well, that's the weaknesses that are there then are just the regular weaknesses of a brain, a mind, forming memory exacerbated by a lack of oxygen in most cases, which to me is sort of like a near-death experience is the mainstream, non-fun version of doing whippets. But
it's funny you mentioned that, because I was gonna I had the opportunity to try marijuana legally in Seattle 3 weeks ago. And what you were describing about losing your memory and then finding explanations for what happened was almost precisely what was happening to me after I tried, like about 5 hours after taking an edible.
Are you trying to say that marijuana brings you closer to God? Is that what it...
I don't know if I'd go that far. It was pretty damn nice, though, I gotta say. But I was having gaps in my memory, and then I was remembering that I had a gap, and then I would seemingly remember what had happened in the gap. You know, for example, like...
Did you remember, or did your brain just fill it in?
Exactly.
Yes.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's the dilemma.
Yeah. Well, I mean, really, most of your memories is your brain filling it in. So oftentimes details of a memory are filled in afterwards by what your brain would expect to be there. Which is
Right. Like, why didn't your brain fill in that this was an alien from Mars jumping up and down on your chest? Like, why did it go... Or a beeping noise wasn't, the countdown for a rocket ship launching per se, but it was a phone. Like it seems like your brain was picking realistic explanations for what these things might be. Not to say that it couldn't pick something strange either. Yeah. The brain is a funny thing.
Perhaps I'm dating myself because I mean I picked up a phone and put it to my head, and that's something.
Was it a rotary phone?
Yeah,
it wasn't,
actually.
but it did have the cord on it still.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, no, what I mean is details like that. It's one of those things where, so I have friends that are close to me where I've heard them recount the same story multiple times, and the details of that story change, and the tone with which they tell that story changes, or at least one added bonus. That's my memories of it.
Right.
So
I was going to say, are you forgetting that?
No, I'm not. It's part of the thing. Is like, well, no, you're remembering that wrong, because the problem is that
I think
your memories are just as human as theirs.
I think the takeaway here is that traumatized brains in general are probably not very reliable, and traumatized brains may probably even be less reliable. So we probably need to be a little bit more cautious about the weight that we give these the weight that we give these experiences when we're concluding that things are true.
Yeah.
I think that's the big takeaway.
I could disagree with that. That seems quite reasonable.
Yeah. If only we had a word for approaching coming to conclusions like that. Like, it could be skeptical.
Logic,
is the word for that?
No. Skepticism?
That is a good one. We needed a new ism. That's what the discourse in America is missing today. Well, this is a good call. It's a good story. I'm glad you called in, Dennis.
I'm glad you survived it, too, to tell us.
Yes. I was about to say yes. Thank you.
If it helps or hurts, people attribute mystical experiences with helping them have life changes. That was the last day I smoked a cigarette, and I've lost about 40 pounds, and I'm taking better care of myself. So
wow.
Well, congratulations, and good for you.
A decent takeaway from it.
That's awesome, Dennis. Appreciate that.
Yeah. All right. Well, we're going to let you go, Dennis.
At some point, I'll be able to see you guys live in Austin, maybe if I get to travel. I'm away from you, but it'd be awesome to be able to come out there and see you guys.
Yeah, let us know.
You can. What you do.
You can always email the show, mail@talkheathen.com, and that's a good way of keeping in touch with us.
I think I'm back on like August 5th. Are you gone? Do you know how that far out?
No, I know that you're going to be on the non-profit.
I was already. I did that already.
I thought you were doing that again.
I am. I don't know. Maybe
just
our wires
move
got
in.
crossed.
We'll put a cot in the back of the library. You can just always be
it is
be on
cozy
all
here.
the shows. Yeah, in a good way. All right, Dennis, I think we're going to move on, but thanks for calling in today.
Yeah, thanks for calling, Dennis.
Have a great one, guys.
That was a very good call. I can't emphasize enough that skepticism isn't just being more rational thinking. There's a lot of needing to learn about biases is pretty much as important as learning.
Oh, yeah.
I would almost say more important than learning the actual name of informal logical fallacies.
Yes, I was just going to say that. I think it would be better if atheists were more familiar with the things that our brains do to process what it is we're experiencing and the frailties of the brain.
Yeah.
That, I think, yes, it's good to know what a logical fallacy is, or that type of ad hominem or something. But it's this understanding of what our brains can do and how we confuse things and the leaps that our brains make.
Yeah.
That is far more interesting and I think more valuable to understand than, am I making a logical fallacy by saying that this is true?
No, you're
because
an ad hominem.
this is, so many people believe this, it's got to be true. Like, yes, it's important to understand how that's a fallacy. And
But
yet,
it's also important to understand why people come to that belief, even though it is a fallacy, which is the frailties of the mind and reasoning.
I have to plug this podcast called You Are Not So Smart. I don't know if you've ever heard of it.
Well, it's not talking about me. No.
Almost every episode focuses on the various things that our brains do and the mistakes our brains are so apt to make. And it is an absolutely phenomenal podcast. I recommend everybody. If you're interested in having good conversations with people to understand how they believe what they believe, the what, the why, and the how, having a good grasp of the things that our brains do is great, and that's a great podcast.
Yeah, and I would recommend The Skeptic's Guide to the Universe, which does news, science, and also, as the name would imply, skepticism.
Well,
So,
I'll see that, and I'll raise you. No.
no,
We could probably go back and forth here.
I was matching your recommendation with, oh yeah, well, I recommend reading all of the books generally, in alphabetical order by...
Why is this popping out?